Oh, this guy's had several days to cure, and I've put probably 4 coats of Krylon Crystal Clear Flat on him. He hasn't had any more paint done to him since the last section of the video, so today we're going to start the first layer of dappling. I just wanted to see what he looks like before we start with the dappling and the detail work. You can see how the sealer has made him quite a bit darker than he was prior to sealing. And it's given his coat a really lustrous glow. In the meantime, my studio is in the basement, and I used to have a dehumidifier down here. It broke, as do many things over the course of time, and I tried to do without one for quite a while. But it was just really inhibiting the cure time and creating some other problems, such as sometimes you get bloom in the paint job, which means the paint will get sort of a grayish cast to it after you spray sealer on it, and that's caused by moisture getting trapped between the layers of sealer and your paint. And the only way to fix it is you can, if you're lucky, maybe sometimes you can lift off the layer of sealer with some mineral spirits. I've only found that that works with Krylon products. It doesn't work with Tester's Dull Coat in my experience. Maybe it would work for you, but not for me. Dull Coat's a lacquer, and I'm not really exactly sure what all Krylon Crystal Clear is, but I know that the mineral spirits will take it off. So, okay, that's this guy right now, and I'm going to go ahead and get set up, and we're going to spray some dappling. And I wanted you to see my airbrush setup. I have a setup of 3 guns here. I have a little stand that they sit in. The first 2 on the left are the Awada microns, and the one on the right is an HPC. I paint with the back off of the microns and the needle cap off. This HPC is an old gun, and it still has the cutout handle on it, and I love that because you can adjust the needle without having to take the back of the gun apart, so I just leave that like that. And again, see, I work without a needle cap. Oh, that looks a little blurry. There we go. And I have all my paints right here within reach. I don't really use any of these airbrush mediums, but I do like to use the Retarder that you see, and I'll show you how I use that in other applications. And I've got shelving here with other paints and supplies and equipment. And to the right here, this is the pad that I'm always talking about that I spray on. I'll test the gun and make sure that I'm getting a fine line, or just to get the spatters off of it. And behind that is my compressor. It's an Iwata Studio series. It has dual regulators on it, and dual tanks, which is really nice because I run the microns at a different pressure level than I run the HPC. Typically I run the microns at around 35 to 40 psi, that's pounds of pressure, and then the big gun I run it at around 15. You'd think it'd be the other way around, but for fine detail work with the microns, I run the gun at a pretty high pressure, and I want like a real thin, fine line of paint. At lower pressures, they seem to get a little too finicky. So I can do my adjustments here. That's the regulators. And you can also see there's a water trap right there. So everything's handled right here on the compressor. And I have the guns attached to the hoses, and I also have what's called a splitter up here. Um, I used to just have one tank and I had all the guns running off one tank, and the splitter allowed me to run 2 guns at once off one side and one on the other. I don't really need the splitter anymore, but it's still attached, so that's kind of how we run things. And this way too, I can turn off the pressure to the two Iwatas, microns, and leave the pressure just to the big gun or vice versa. And there's also a place to hook another hose if I want to hook more guns up. I usually have paint in all 3 at the same time, and that way instead of having to empty my gun, I can add a little darker shading or add another color and go back and forth between all 3. Okay, so let's get started on the dappling on this guy. One of the things I want to mention about this Iwata airbrush is it's primarily a detail brush, and I really like to use this specific micron for doing the dapple work. You want to make sure that your needle is nice and clean when you're doing detail work, because if it's got paint stuck on it as it slides through the body of the brush, it's going to stick and hang up, and that's going to prevent you from getting nice, smooth, evenly flowing lines. So this is airbrush oil. I just put a little drop on my finger, and then I wipe it down the brush, and then slide the brush, or wipe it down the needle and slide it into the brush. And you want to make sure that your needle's properly seated. You can feel where it sort of ends in the barrel, and I like to make sure it's snug but not jammed in there. And then tighten the chuck on the end of the needle. Feel it, pull it back and forth, make sure it's sliding smoothly. This looks like we're ready to go, so we're going to mix up some paint. Again, we're going to stick with our color scheme of burnt sienna, Comart, and badger black. But this time, we're going to add golden acrylic retarder. What this does is it prevents your paint from drying very quickly, and we just add a little bit, and it will keep the paint from drying in the brush. It helps prevent clogs, and it gives you an amazing flow. It does tend to make the paint thicker, but these Comart paints are super thin. I mean, they're like, I just splashed myself. They're like the consistency of water. And so this does thicken it up, and by thickening it, it does give you a little bit more control. If you are spraying dappling and you have to get close to the horse and your paint's really thin, when the paint hits the horse, especially on a really slick surface like this piece, it's going to want to spray and splatter, and you're going to get what look like little spider legs coming off of your paint job. The retarder will thicken the paint. It has a great adhesion, and it'll help prevent some of those spider things happening. Okay, so I need to shake this up. We're going to start out with a fairly light color. We're going to put mostly burnt sienna. And again, just a tiny drop of the badger black, and I'll pick that up off of my palette rather than risk dripping it into the cup and not really having any control. We want to stay fairly light because we want to build several layers of dappling to give more detail. And with each progressive layer, then it'll get a little bit darker. I don't want to be too light because then I'll have big bright red circles, so I need to stay at least slightly darker than the color that's on here already so that the dappling will show up, but not so dark that it looks like black circles. And I'll show you how we'll test that in a minute. Okay, we're going to add some of this golden retarder I just start out with, you'll see it's just a big glop. This does also make your paint a little less opaque, and this paint isn't very opaque to begin with. So I don't know if you can see that. It doesn't change the color, but it does change the opacity, and the more of it you put in, the more translucent your paint becomes. So again, I mix everything in the cup. I'm using a clay shaper. They're non-absorbent, and so it's not like using a paintbrush with the hair in it, and I don't get hair caught in my brush. It's just a nice pointy little silicone tip, and I mix it right in the brush cup. It looks like a good consistency, and so I'm going to check it out on my pad over here, and then we'll start painting. I want to start out on the tummy, that way if I make a mistake, it's a little easier to hide than if it's right on the side of the horse. So I'm going to do I do the figure 8 dappling. You probably can't see that very well, but that's just what I want for the first layer. It's very subtle, and I like the color. I don't really want dappling on my horse's stomach, so I'm going to take a Q-tip, dampen it with some water, and I'll just wipe that off. That way I can test the color on my horse. And that'll dry, and we'll go back up here and start our dappling. I don't know if you're fortunate enough to have more than one airbrush, but I have 2 microns, and I actually do have one that's a favorite for doing dappling. The needle actually sticks out about 1/16 of an inch farther on this gun, and it just gives me a little more control and a little better detail. So this is my favorite for doing dapples, and I put a piece of blue tape on the hose so I know which gun is which. Okay, so I'm going to work on doing some figure 8 dappling. I do like to make the circles some a little bit bigger, some a little bit smaller. And I did get a little bit of a runny spot there. It's just a little bit too wide, so I'm going to take my Q-tip and take that off. I don't really like the way it looks. The paint is just a little bit lighter than I would like, so I'm going to add a little bit more black to it. Maybe you'll be able to see it better too. I don't want to go too dark, but you need to be able to see what we're doing. So I'm adding just one more drop of the black. That looks really dark in the gun, but as I mix it, it's evening out a little bit more. Check it on the pad. And I'll do like 3 or 4 of the little dapple shapes. Some a little bigger, some a little smaller. I like to make the edges not perfectly round, but sort of almost like make your hand shake a little bit as you create the dapples. You don't want jagged edges, but you don't want perfectly round so that your dappling looks like a chain link fence. And this layer is supposed to be subtle. It'll fade down into the darker shading on the horse. Mostly I just want it in these lighter areas, but I will blend it into the darker areas. So just let it travel down into the darker shading. You might notice I did wrap a paper towel around the horse's hind legs. That way the oils from my hands don't rub off onto the paint, and that way my hands don't rub the paint off the horse, so that I have rubs I'd have to fix. Okay, looks pretty subtle, but that's what we want at this stage. I don't want, you know, it to look like I said, dark chain link fence. I just want a base layer of dappling that I'm going to build on. We'll go up across the top line, some bigger, some smaller. There's a nice light area here, but I'm going to leave that. I just want my dappling to be across the sides and down into the flank area. Okay, we're starting to get a little bit of a buildup on the brush, or on the tip of the needle. I don't know if you can see that, but we'll take the Q-tip, wipe the paint off the needle. Again, you don't want to try to force the gun to keep painting when you see that there's no paint coming out, because if you do, then you're going to end up with a chunk or a spatter. So you want to wipe that paint off. I pull the needle back into the brush and then see that the paint's wicking onto the Q-tip, and I know then that my gun's clean. Wipe it off the needle again, test it over here on the pad, and we're good to go back to work. I want to blend some of the dappling into the shading on the stomach, and just let it gradually come back up the body. And I am working a little bit over top of the dapples that I just did. I want to exactly retrace them. I don't want to build dappling in a separate layer that doesn't match the first layer. Otherwise it looks blurred and you don't get good clear dappling. You get sort of a, I call it a mossy look. It looks like there's just moss growing around the side of your horse. Okay, let's work on this side a little bit. My dapples are typically from maybe just over 1/8 of an inch to about 3/16 of an inch. This is in keeping with a traditional scale model, a 1 to 9 horse, meaning 1 inch on a model is 9 inches on an actual horse. So you don't want great big, what we call dinner plate dapples, although some horses do have really big dramatic dappling in real life. That's kind of hard to pull off on a model. Some horses, their colors are so dramatic that it doesn't really carry through into a model. So you have to be careful that you stay realistic with your work. The whole idea is to recreate what we see in life. But sometimes life is a little bit unbelievable. So unless you have accurate documentation that you can present with your model, sometimes that's not always the best choice, is, you know, to choose the bizarre or the insanely unique, because that's not maybe what we're always looking for in the show ring. Sometimes, you know, I'm not saying don't try or don't dare to do something different, but ideally we're trying to reproduce life with the model horses, and so you want to strive for the most realism possible. Gotta clean the tip of the needle again. Some folks think airbrushing is a pain because there's so much cleaning involved, but you know, I've painted with a paintbrush too, and your paintbrush gets overloaded with paint. You clean it off, it gets colors mixed in that you don't want, you clean it off. I don't think there's really any more cleaning with a paintbrush than there is with an airbrush, or vice versa. I like to just go slow with the dappling, take my time so that I can see each individual dapple. With the next layer, what I'm going to do is go back and pick out individual dapples and actually redraw them, so I like to be able to see accurately now where they're at. Even though it's just a light layer right now, the light layer will be what blends into the rest of the shading. So I don't want to go completely dark now, then I lose my opportunity to have dark and light shading in the dapples. And I'm starting to get a really interesting development of dappling right here. You can see where the fade comes down into the flank. I've actually done a second layer here and just picked out these few little dapples that I did a second coat on. You know, sometimes horses have perfectly even dappling. Sometimes they have areas of dark and light shading through the dappling. They'll have lighter dapples, darker dapples. You know, for sake of interest, I like to have some variation in the dappling. I can always go back and rebuild layers and make it all even if I want to. But at this stage, I like to give myself as many opportunities as I can. If I make it all even, then I've just closed off the ability to have that sort of variation in the paintwork. So even though this is just a model horse, it still is, I consider, a work of art, and it allows me to use what is called artistic license. Even though my reference material here that we have in front of me doesn't have any dappling, for this piece we want to use some subtle dappling just to make the paint job more interesting. Okay, I'm going to come back to this side and I'm going to do a little more dappling down into this light area here. I'm hoping that you can see the dappling in the video, because it's, I mean, it's really light. I can see it pretty well, but of course my nose is only about 4 inches from the piece, and so I know where they're at. In the next stage of dappling, then we're gonna again build onto these layers, but we want to put down a good solid base coat of pale dappling for this layer that we can build on in the next layer. Remember, you can always go darker, but it's really difficult once you've darkened up your light areas to ever get them back. Especially when you start out with these metallic bottom layers like I did with this piece. Once you cover that up, it's almost impossible to rebuild it. Okay, I'm just going to sit here and paint for a few minutes. I need to kind of focus on what I'm doing. Sometimes when I'm talking I get distracted, so I'm just going to paint. And I hope you enjoy watching. Sometimes I think about Bob Ross with his happy little trees, and I'm doing happy little dapples. Okay, you can kind of see how this is starting to build up a little bit. I've gone back and done a second layer. I probably shouldn't do that, but sometimes I get a little impatient and I want to see this coat color come together. Ideally, you do one layer and then you stop, let the horse sit overnight and cure. Yeah, Pennsylvania, lots of humidity, so it's a long wait. And then the next morning I put sealer coat, and that evening then the horse is good to go again. But I feel like the brush is working really well right now. I feel like the paint's just right, and it was okay to keep going. If not, I could wipe it off with a Q-tip and start over. So I'm going to keep going. And you'll see too, like at first when you put the dappling on, it looks darker, but as it dries, it sort of blends into the coat, or it disappears completely. That's because when you first put it on, the paint's wet. And so it's just actually showing up on top of the dry paint layer underneath of it. But again, it gives me an opportunity to change it before it sets up. Once it's dry, it's a little harder to get off, but not too much. I was just using the gun to dry that area right there. Okay, let's work on the other side a little bit. Again, you want to work on both sides so that your horse is balanced. I try to get as much done each time on each side so that I don't run out of paint halfway and have to mix up another batch and possibly not get the paint exactly the same. Then you're trying to match one side of the horse to the other, and that can be difficult. little clog on the airbrush. Got to clean the tip off. I have a little container sitting over there that has Windex and water in it, and I dip the Q-tip in that and then wipe the needle, tap the end of the gun, wipe the needle again, spray the pad, and we're good to go. I'm not going to go any darker with this layer because I want to save that for the next step, and we'll go darker on the next layer of dappling, but I don't want to go darker on this one because if I make a mistake, then I won't be able to get rid of it without getting rid of everything that I've already done. So we'll save darker for the next layer. And the next layer, you'll see we're just going to pick out certain areas of dappling and actually highlight that, build on it. And that way we have our lovely fades, and we'll have layers of more pronounced and dramatic dappling. Not too dramatic. I mean, not like we're doing a dapple gray or something. Although we will do that in another video. We're not going to do that type of dappling on this guy. I think that's a good spot to stop for this round of dappling. It's fairly subtle, but that's what we want for this layer. So you can see how you can see the dappling the way the horse turns and the light changes. You can see it and then not see it. Okay, that's enough for today. We're going to let this guy sit. He'll need to cure. I did get a dehumidifier, so it should reduce some of my dry times. But he is going to sit overnight, have sealer in the morning, and then tomorrow we will do the darker dappling.